So thank you very much for a brilliant talk. And I'm now very pleased to introduce Nathan Pevy from Sheffield. Over to you.
Hello. Yeah, you can hear me. Okay, so this presentation is about the research that I conducted in my PhD. And we're interested in whether we can predict the cause of transient loss of consciousness using an automated clinical decision tool. And so that's my supervisor research team, and the research was funded by Epilepsy Research UK. So to give some background, 90% of cases of transient loss of consciousness are caused by either epilepsy, functional seizures, or syncope, and there's currently quite a high misdiagnosis rate. And there's been some previous research conducted by the group to look at whether we can predict the cause of transient loss of consciousness using a symptom and medical history questionnaire. And this graph shows the performance of this questionnaire across its different iterations. So it started off as an 86-item patient-only questionnaire, and there's here's the performance for that. They looked at how well it improved when they included witness observations, which was an additional 31 items, and there was, I'll just let you see the changes in performance. And then subsequently they looked at how well it performed if they reduced the number of items that was included in the questionnaire. So they used a random forest feature selection to select the best performing items. And then in terms of the best performance, it was when they included both patient and witness items. And they identified 100% of cases of syncope, and it struggled with the differentiation between epilepsy and functional seizures. So in terms of what I was hoping to do is looking at whether we can improve the differential diagnosis between epilepsy and functional seizures in order to try and improve the overall performance of that questionnaire. And there's previous research to show that people with epilepsy or functional seizures typically describe their seizures quite differently. These are differences in linguistic, interactional, and communicational behaviors. And the previous research has developed a diagnostic scoring aid, which is used by trained linguists who look at transcripts of interactions between a doctor and a patient, and they score each item and then aggregate those total with a decision boundary to determine whether it's epilepsy or functional seizures. So I've just put on some of the items from that diagnostic scoring aid for people to see, and typically higher scores are indicative of epilepsy and lower scores are indicative of functional seizures. And this has been tested across a range of studies in different countries, and they typically find that it can be used to predict the diagnosis of an accuracy ranging between 80 to 90%. So this is the justification for looking at language. So in terms of this project, I was interested in, firstly, how well that condensed symptom and medical history questionnaire worked when it was applied to a novel sample, particularly patients who were first presenting to seizure clinics. We wanted to see whether we could predict seizures using an automated analysis of spoken descriptions of transient loss of consciousness, and then whether the analysis of these spoken descriptions improved the performance of the questionnaire. So these images are just screenshots of the application that we used to collect the data. So we had an online consent form. Patients then went through and answered all of the questions, and then they interacted with a virtual agent, which was quite basic, really. Basically, they played a video that asked the question, and when the video was finished playing, it recorded their spoken response. And the question asked about their most recent loss of consciousness, and then some follow-up questions that probed on details about what happened before, during, and afterwards. In terms of recruitment, we were hoping to recruit quite a lot of participants, but we got all of our ethics approved, and then as we was about to start recruitment, COVID started, and that kind of threw everything. So we got fewer participants than we'd hoped, but we recruited 76 patients using the IPEP, but not everybody completed the whole procedure and interacted with the virtual agent. And there was a range of reasons for that. Some of it was time constraints, and others were technological limitations. The application, it's quite hard to make an application to collect spoken recordings, and we had to quickly change it at the last minute to try and make it. We was going to recruit at the hospital, and then we had to put it on the internet, so it was restricted in terms of some of the devices that could be used, so that was a slight problem. And in terms of, I want to point out that we got quite few participants with syncope, which I think is quite noteworthy. So what we did to start with was looked at how well the questionnaire worked at predicting the diagnosis, and we trained a support vector machine using a procedure called leave one out cross-validation, and it had an overall accuracy of 65.8%. It's slightly different to how well it performed in the original research. It was better identifying syncope previously, and it had a higher general accuracy. And we didn't include witness responses in this analysis because we didn't collect enough witnesses, so that's something we're hoping to do in the future. So this is just patient-only responses. In terms of the automated analysis of language, so I guess I want to point out that the speech profiles exist based on previous research, and we're just trying to determine methods of measuring these speech profiles. So we've come up with some features to try and do that, but I think this is going to be an iterative process, so the features that we use in future research may be guided by this, but hopefully will be different and more widespread. But we used 7 features to measure formulation efforts, such as hesitations, repetitions, keywords associated with uncertainty, and how people paused during their descriptions. We tested these features on a data set of doctor-patient interactions, and it was previously had an accuracy of 71%, so we took it forward for this analysis. Semantic categories, so the linguistic and query and word count application measures the proportion of words that correspond to different semantic categories. We previously tested 21 as in like our doctor-patient interactions to see how well they worked, and we took 9 categories from that analysis that were the best performing and used them in this analysis. And then the features we tested previously didn't capture any differences in the descriptions of subjective symptoms or the actions people were doing during the seizure. So we included some features that measured the verbs, adjectives, and adverbs that was included in the description. And the way that these features work is it identifies certain words that are indicative of epilepsy or functional seizures. One of the dilemmas we had is we had to consider how we would integrate the language analysis with the questionnaire data. We could take an approach of just using all of the questionnaire features and all the language features and all 3 diagnostic classes and training a single model. But the difference in language and the previous research is all based on the differentiation between epilepsy and functional seizures. And the questionnaire typically in previous research performed quite well at detecting people with syncope. So we looked at a second approach where we just restricted the language analysis to predictions of epilepsy or functional seizures. So this is a schematic that outlines how that works. But basically, if the IPEP predicted syncope or they didn't have a recording, then we use the IPEP as the final prediction. If it predicted epilepsy or functional seizures, then these participants were passed on to that second stage, and then their prediction was updated based upon the output of the language analysis. So there was a final model that took their prediction of the IPEP and the 3 different feature sets and then predicted a final diagnosis. So in terms of performance, we found that our language features were quite good at predicting differentiating between epilepsy and functional seizures. So this graph here is just for the binary classification between the 2 groups. The formulation effort features and the linguistic query word count features were better in this analysis than our previous one, but the thing we took away is that they performed well on 2 data sets now. And the verb, adjectives, and adverb features performed reasonably well as well. When we did an analysis that included participants with syncope, it really reduced the performance of these language features. And this might be because people with syncope have overlapping linguistic profiles that overlap in some ways with people with epilepsy and in some ways with people with functional seizures. Or it could be that we just didn't have enough patients with syncope, so the model wasn't able to adequately detect that group. And then in terms of, and we combined the IPEP and the language features, the green bars show the first method where we just threw everything together and trained a model, and the blue bar shows the performance when we did that kind of stacking approach. And we found that overall the accuracy was 85%, so it improved on the IPEP by 20%. And it improved the detection of epilepsy and FDS, and that's how it worked. So the predictions for syncope was obviously still the same, so it did help with that further differential diagnosis. So in terms of summarising, firstly, we took from this that you can, using a virtual agent to collect these spoken seizure descriptions is potentially a feasible way of collecting that data. We did a conversational analysis study on them responses too, which I'm not talking about today, but a lot of the features of that communication profile is present in these recordings too. We were taking from it that an automated analysis of language is potentially a good method to take forward and explore further, and that this could improve the performance of questionnaire-based machine learning models. And then in terms of future research, just going to check the time. there's so much we can do really in terms of a lot. So the way that I view the project is that we've kind of just done an initial feasibility exploration, but we're hoping to use what we've done so far to kind of be a springboard for future research. And there's just lots and lots of avenues that we can go down. So firstly, we want to recruit more participants because the IPEP performance on this analysis was quite low. But if we think that if we had a larger sample, then that model would perhaps be performing better. Obviously, the inclusion of witness responses could be quite important for improving the performance, both in terms of the questionnaire, but also looking at how witnesses describe what they saw in the seizure. So we have collected witness descriptions, but again, there was just too few to do any sort of analysis with that at the moment. We want to look at whether we can predict syncope based upon the descriptions, and there's going to be some conversation analysis work to look at how they describe them and how they're different to the other groups, and then hopefully some automated stuff as well. And then also, this application will be dependent on speech recognition, so we're going to have to do some work to make that tailored towards seizure descriptions, and then also potentially increasing the scope of the questions. So I've done another study collecting feedback from the users, and they've given lots of feedback on how the application could be better. And one of the things that came out a lot is that people want to say more. They don't want to just talk about the seizures. They think there's a lot of information that they think is relevant. So we're hopefully going to increase the scope of the questions and dig into how useful that could be for predicting the diagnosis. But yeah, thank you.
Terrific, thanks. That was absolutely fascinating. Any questions from the floor?
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I was just wondering, forgive me, I may have missed something in terms of your description of recruitment, but I just wondered whether or not you looked at or accounted for clinical contact in advance of your assessment, insofar as the potential for language used to be influenced by clinicians that had already reviewed these patients.
We haven't considered that in terms of this analysis, but I think it is a really valid point. So we do, in our study, we had some participants who were first presenting and some participants who had been seeing clinicians for a longer time. And when I was doing the qualitative analysis, I did notice that there were differences in how people described symptoms. So one thing I noted is that people who've been seeing clinicians for a long time will often describe things as like known, and they'll kind of skip over descriptions that they've given to clinicians quite a lot and focus on like something that was perhaps novel, and that's happened recently. So I think it does have an impact on it. And I think there are lots of compounds for this sort of analysis, and we would be looking to dig into them over a longer period of time and as we collect more data. But I think, as you say, it's quite important to consider that. Thank you.
Hi, Tom Cope. I was wondering what your sort of gold standard is. Presumably your dissociative versus epileptic versus syncope is clinician determined rather than them having had objective tests like video telemetry. And many of your measures seem to sort of tap into the kind of spidey sense we get in clinic of how the patients describe their convulsions. So I was just wondering about your how you manage potential bias and confounds in that. Given that it's essentially the same information being tapped into, and whether you think your app is essentially designed to save clinician time or whether it's giving additional complementary information.
So the gold standard we're striving for would be like video EEG and like tilt testing, if that's what you mean. And you're not everyone in our data set has that, so that is obviously something to consider. And then in terms of the aim, it's as an additional measure, as an additional tool that clinicians can use to kind of, like they'll be doing the tests anyway, and we won't want to replace any tests that already happen, but help them kind of interpret some of the tests that they have conducted so alongside it. And I think based on the feedback from patients, that's what patients would want it to be used for as well, not to replace anything that currently happens, more just as an additional information. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's something to think about going forward, where this is placed, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think time for one last question.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm sure there's a very complicated and long answer to this question, but I wonder if you could just tell us kind of broadly what the differences were in linguistic profiles between the patients with functional seizures and epileptic seizures.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk about the previous qualitative research. Some of the differences are how much people focus on their subjective experience of the seizure, so how much details they provide of their subjective symptoms. Another difference is people with, and that's more typical of people with epilepsy. People with epilepsy are more likely to contour the unconscious period, so they'll describe the immediate memory before and after they lost consciousness and kind of have it sandwiched as that kind of three-step process. People with non-epileptic seizures were more likely to kind of make complete negations, so say they can't remember anything and kind of not provide them details. And in our study in particular, and this has been shown in previous research, people with functional seizures were more likely to rely on third parties in answering the questions, so they involve them in the interaction more frequently. But it's quite an extensive profile, so there's more than that. Could I just add something else as well, if I have another minute? So just in case people are interested in speech processing research, I did my PhD in neuroscience, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I did my PhD in neuroscience, but I'm now working in computer science on this sort of technology, but in a wider scope. And we're going to be running a roundtable workshop in the future with clinicians and speech processing researchers to look at how we can branch out and what clinicians want out of technology like this, if they want anything, and other future avenues of research. If anyone's ever interested in that, then please do speak to me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nathan.